Yeah, so welcome everyone to this recording of my presentation that I prepared for the Colloquium of Cultural Heritage. And I'm very, very grateful for Oyvind to invite me for this opportunity. And I want to introduce my PhD topic in this presentation, however, with a particular focus on two processes that I'm interested in, namely tracing and translating. And I'm looking at journeys, especially journeys beyond Europe, that are appearing or that are the topic of British female travel writing. My name is Jasmin. I am a PhD student at the University of Konstanz. I'm working and also teaching at the Department for English Literature and Culture. And this PhD project is written in the context of, especially in the context of cultural studies. And I hope through not only this more particular lens of literary studies, but rather cultural studies, I hope that this project in at least some way might be interesting for you as archaeologists, as historians, as digital humanists. Yeah, and I'm excited to hear your opinions on this project. See, it's just my title. My official title is Unprecedented Paths Beyond Europe, British Female Travel Writing from 6080 to 7080. So it's a pretty basic, boring PhD title. Though what I find very particular about what the period that I'm writing about is that it is rather ignored in most of the research that you can find in travel writing. Especially when we look at the female part, so writing by women about women protagonists. And so these unprecedented paths that I want to describe are not actual paths that are not known to travelers, but rather that these paths were unknown to women or to other minority groups that come into focus through the writing of these female writers and explorers. But before we go into travel writing, I want to talk about some of my basic blocks that I'm using as my thematic core. And as you might see from this, I very much focus on spatial aspects. The first one is the center and periphery, which is very much tied to spaces that are considered in the center, for instance, of a national consciousness versus the periphery, but also cultures, as well as people, as well as political dimensions, cultural interests, social spaces, etc. The center and periphery relations are always important, especially when you look at a genre like travel writing, which is very much about leaving the center to explore the periphery, or even try to figure out where the periphery starts and ends, and what kind of limitations are there, what kind of borders are there to go beyond that delineates the center from the periphery. The other aspect that is more straightforward is the aspect that we of course have British authors. I decided on that because I'm from the Department of British Literature and Culture, so I obviously decided on that. But of course we have with the British literature and a colonial history, a particular colonial history that is very interesting to consider and to look at when we have female writers that are not always accounted for as also colonial writers. And we often don't see them in this narrative, in this colonial narrative. Something that I added, and this is why this is also in blue, is the aspect of the Central Europe and how some female travelers first traveled through Europe and then went beyond Europe. And they created through this traveling from the British Isles to Europe and then beyond that a very interesting triangular travel travel route that sets oftentimes Europe not only in opposition to the British, but also to what they experience beyond Europe. And I think this aspect, that we not only have a clear-cut opposition between what they consider as home, which is then the British, and what is not British, but also Europe in between, which is foreign, but not so much foreign as, for instance, Constantinople. I think that creates tensions that are not considered enough in the research that I'm doing. And so we have not only a relation, and a very complicated relation, between Central Europe and wherever they go beyond Europe, but also the very much far away othering, as we call it, this process of othering, everything that is not considered a part of the self identity, and this British national identity. And of course, that is tied to the center and periphery as well. So the question is if only British can be considered the center, or if also Central Europe is still the center in the perspective of the female British traveler. And this poses already many questions that we can ask, and that I want also to pose in this project. So what is even travel writing, and how do we account for it? And maybe this genre is also interesting for some of you who might be interested more in history or in particular types of archaeology, since travel writing is often considered as a factual genre. However, travel writing is also often regarded, especially in the early modern period, which I'm looking at, as an primary genre of entertainment, and we can never be sure if these accounts are entirely factual or fictional. And so what literary scholars try to do is come up with definitions that are not too hung up on this question of factuality and fictionality, but rather that they play with it. And other than that, it has been quite difficult to pinpoint down any kind of definitive aspects that you can find in all of travel writing. But I find this attempt, first of all, very informative. This is by Boehm, also from a essay that serves as an introduction to travel writing, but also introduces some of the aspects that you can find in a lot of other definitions. And so Boehm says travel writing is considered as any narrative characterized by a non-fiction dominant that relates almost always in the first person a journey or journeys that the reader supposes to have taken place in reality, while assuming or presupposing that author, narrator, and principal character are but one and the same. And I think one of the most important aspects is that we have this intersection of the author, narrator, and principal character, even though I would be careful with that, and I don't say, if I talk about a character, I always suppose that this is the fictional creation of the author, even though they might be the same, or even they might be called the same person. And also that it seems non-fiction, but oftentimes it's just the sense of fiction that we get, or non-fiction that we get from the narrative. Which brings me to three, again, fundamental factors that I want to introduce in my PhD very early on as the definitive factors of travel writing that I want to look at, is the ability to traverse, translate, and to testify, and that we see these factors way much more in travel writing than any other kind of genre. And if we understand these three factors, we might also better understand our sources. And with these factors, I also want to go into already some of the aspects that I might think can then be taken further from a traditional literary or cultural studies point of view to the digital realm. So the first factor, traversing, what I mean with that is that we have in travel writing many different kinds of border crossings. social, cultural, political, and of course spatial. And this process of traversing back and forth between these kind of borders, so between different cultures, to move between different kinds of political systems, social systems, is what makes travel writing such a fascinating genre, and makes it a genre very, very different from other kinds, for instance, like the fantasy genre or the Bildungsroman, and other classical genres like that. But I also think that this process of border crossing, so going back and forth between places, gives us a toolbox, or gives us a gateway for a very important question of what kind of spaces are we even dealing with. And one concept of border spaces that I intend to use, or is the first step to my own concept of the border space, is Emily Pratt's contact zone, which she famously introduces in her monograph Imperial Eyes, which is a must read when we focus on travel writing. And she introduces a definition of these kind of, how she calls it, social spaces. And I quote here from the slide again: "The disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations of domination and subordination, such as colonialism and slavery, or their aftermaths as they are lived out across the globe today." And I very much appreciate this definition, and I think it's very true. She develops it in her case studies, where she focuses on travel writing that is written in the high times of colonialism, so during the Victorian age, when Britain becomes this grand empire. And of course, it's very right to say that we have these cultures that meet, and they oftentimes violently meet in these spaces, even though she says, well, the traveler is somewhat different in that regard, because they meet with these other cultures in peace, though there's still a sort of passive violence in these encounters oftentimes. And I think what she leaves out here is a clear definition of how these contact zones come into existence. How long are they around? Are they still around? What are the factors of a contact zone to exist? Where are the borders of this border space, basically? And she also defines the space very much with the focus on the social aspect. So she defines the space just on the people that encounter each other. So the space itself is not really relevant, but rather the people inside it, and how these people move around the space. So this space is very abstract, and I think I would rather go to border studies for the start of a definition that takes into this social aspect and these kind of cultural and political dimensions, but also gives us a suggestion that it's tied to an actual space. The first concept I want to talk about is Mary Pratt's contact zone, which she introduces in her monograph Imperial Eyes, that is focused on travel writing in a later state of British imperialism. And her definition of this space as social spaces is very informative, where she, and I quote here, defines them as these contact zones are spaces where disparate cultures meet, clash, and grapple with each other, often in highly asymmetrical relations and of domination and subordination, such as colonialism and slavery, or the aftermaths as they are lived out across the globe today. And I won't argue with this definition. I think it's very true. However, for my particular interests, which are more focused on colonialism in a state where it's just developing, so we don't have these kind of fixed encounterings, but rather I want to figure out if there are instead spaces that by their location, by their spatiality, and not because of the people who encounter there, offer these possibilities of cultures that clash, but also that appear, that have the possibilities to appear on these borders, instead of just, let's say, typical binaries, typical oppositions coming into close contact and often into violent contact. I want to ask, well, what about the outlines of it? What about the borders within the borders? And for that, I turn, obviously, as the name already suggests, to border studies. This means that I see border studies as a potential to create a definition that fits my research more and that also is a bit more flexible and not too much tied to the late British imperialism and its history. And so I started my research with basic definitions of border studies by, for instance, Van Houten, which I find particularly striking, where he defines the field as border studies as the study of human practices that constitute and represent differences in space, observing bordering not simply in the distant geopolitical affairs, often between territorial states, but in the messy here and now micropolitics of everyday life, practices, and experiences. This includes that we not only look at borders as spaces rather than lines, not only as walls, instead we look at them in also abstract ways. A border can be, at both times, can be national, it can be definitive. On the other hand, it can also be displaced. As well, what I also liked as well is that he focuses on this messy here and now micropolitics. And this is, I think, exactly where I want to pinpoint my border spaces as well. It's not that these spaces are the exception, that they are these official spaces of encountering, but rather that spaces where people live and where they live out their lives, and the traveler comes into these everyday spaces as the foreign object or the foreign subject, and then experiences this space. So he's invading it or she is invading it, rather than it's imagined as an encountering space of equal forces. And I think this already puts Pratt's definition as well into a different perspective that I can use for my research questions. And one of the most interesting approaches from border studies comes from somebody who is particularly not a geographer, but rather comes from the social science and wants to look at Europe as a construct and try to figure out how Europe functions not only as a nation, but also as a consciousness, as an identity, and what kind of borders Europe creates to determine itself, but also what kind of borders prevent Europe from actually feeling like a national identity for many. And he introduces three major aspects of the equivocal character of borders in history, where he also goes into imperial history. And these three aspects are that the borders are overdetermined, polysemic, and coincided. And so all of these three aspects, without going into detail about them, hint at the fact that borders are always very multiple in their character. They have multiple meanings at once. They can have many different identities at once. They can mean different things to different people. So a border might be an actual border, a line not only drawn on the map, but maybe a wall. But this wall has different meanings to different kinds of people. And if you expand this to this idea that borders are not only lines, but rather spaces, I think that this becomes even more interesting, that we can have a space that is layered with meanings based on the people that use it in a very very much everyday life practice way, as we just described it. And that then if the traveler comes into this space, it's not a border space because the traveler comes from a different culture, encountering in this space some other culture that is not familiar to the traveler, but rather that this space is already there and offers an entrance to a different culture. It is meant to be a space that is polysemic, that coincides, that where different nationalities and different meanings coincide. And so I'm much interested in these kinds of spaces. So not in just encounters, but rather in spaces that enable encounters. The second essential aspect of travel writing, as I would argue, is this concept of translation. And I don't only mean linguistic translations, like translating from one language to the other, but also more abstract processes of translation, for instance, cultural translation or translation of experiences. And I found particularly inspiring this essay by Basnet, where she compares the duties or the responsibilities, so rather say responsibilities, of a translator in comparison to a travel writer, and she sees a lot of similarities. So let me just read this quote from Basnet. She says that the translator explores a text written in another time and place and brings back his or her version of that exploratory process in the form of a translation. The travel writer produces a different kind of translation, a version of a journey that he or she claims to have undertaken. Both processes involve complex relationships with readers. The reader is required to make a leap of faith and to trust both travel writer and translator. And I think one of the most interesting aspects that I introduced here is this very essential factor of the reader, and her reader response makes the travel writing genre also very different from other genres in regard of what they aim to invoke in the reader. And so they try to make it sound as their journey as authentic as possible. That when you read travel writing, you feel like you are on the journey with this traveler, or you feel like you are in their shoes, even experiencing as they experience their journey. And we need to be careful what kind of processes, what happens in the process between the experience, so the initial experience, and the experience that we have as the literary text before us. And we need to be careful that we have a clear distinction of these two aspects. So this is also why I say, well, we need to be careful calling this a factual source, because it is always in between the fictional and the factual. And this is, I think, exactly why we have, even if we have a traveler who we know from just different sources that they actually had this journey, and then they come back and then they write to it, there is always this gap between the actual experience and then writing down this experience. And this experience will always be from a subjective view of this one individual. And you might see a problem with calling this a factual or a actual historical account when you just ask, for instance, your family how they experienced the travel that you took together, for instance, as a family or a group of friends. They will tell different experiences, or even just one event will be told in very different manners. And so when we look at travel writing, even if it's based on an actual experience, it is an abstraction of that in literary form, and there is always something from the author in this, as well as that the text reflects a particular intention, that it's addressed to readers that expect a claim of authenticity, that they have this sense of verisimilitude, that it just feels very like an authentic experience. And especially when we look at 18th century British writing, we have a craze of scientific travel accounts. So even more, travel writing was supposed to be a piece of scientific exploration endeavors, and the result of a scientific travel. Um, and even those accounts are sometimes catalogs of flora and fauna, of people that they meet, of spaces. They are still abstracted accounts, abstracted pieces of information. And I think this becomes very important when we want to look at, for instance, the border spaces are spaces that are cultural artifacts, but not historical moments. And I hope this becomes more clear as I go on and explain what kind of theory I then use on travel writing to, on the one hand, be conscious about it being something historical, something that happened happened in the 18th century, that it's based on journeys that actually happened, it's based on places that actually exist or existed, but on the other hand, that it's still an abstraction of these experiences, of these places, of these people. The last point that I want to mention, and this is something that ties into what I just said about translation processes, is that travel writing can be considered, and very much more than any other genre, as a testimony of colonial history and science. So the traveler was often part of these journeys that were also conquests, but they also created accounts that enhanced this idea in the British mind that was still at home, still in Britain. It enhanced this idea of the vast British Empire that most British citizens never experienced on their own, but they still knew about it through the accounts of countless travelers that existed, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century. And so it helped to also reason for the British Empire. It also was a medium to criticize it. So many critics on, for instance, slavery in the Americas was also part of travel accounts. But also very early conquests, of course, are mediated to us even today through their travel accounts that still exist, for instance, by Marco Polo as one famous example. This I mean, this is something that is very much established in travel writing research and literary research, as well as colonial history. But it becomes destabilized when we look at it from the periphery. For instance, from the perspective of minorities that are not considered in this idea of colonial history. For instance, women, British women, who are not considered part of colonial conquest endeavors. And so here's a quotation by Bowles, who is also very famous in travel writing research. And she writes that the travel writer, like the aesthetic subject, was normatively male in an age when the home was literary and symbolically a woman's place. And just a side quote that is one of my favorites is that when we talk about British women outside of Britain, they sometimes say that they established an empire on their own in the house that they built outside of Britain. So the house outside of Britain becomes an empire on their own. The imaginary topographies of Western travel, its stagings of self and other, were systematically gendered and powerfully institutionalized. You just have to look at metaphorical names like the Virgin Land to see how gendered colonial history is. Women did not fit the traveler's image as heroic explorers, scientists, or authoritative cultural interpreters. That's the question of where do these minorities then fit in, like women, like mulattoes, like Creoles, nomads, like traveling folk, for instance, which is an idea that Oyvind gave me, and I'm very grateful for it. It's a question like, well, where are all these people that played an important part in it, but are not the main figures or not even mentioned oftentimes in these essential pieces of colonial history, which is then, of course, travel writing. And so looking at female travel writing immediately puts us in this position of rethinking how we perceive colonial history, or to just have a repositioning of colonial history that includes a more diverse perspective of voices. That is ultimately my attention, and that is hopefully makes sense when we look at what I said about that my focus is on border spaces. Of course, these border spaces are there or need to be explored because we have these minority groups that otherwise would not be visible. We need to find these spaces where these people come into place, come into existence, in literary spaces that are also not in the center, but rather on the outer skirts of colonial history and of colonial writing. So that you get an idea of what kind of sources I'm talking about. This is now my table of contents that I constructed for my PhD thesis. Of course, I guess it will change a lot during my research still, but as for now, my introduction is centered around these three factors that I just talked about, so traversing, translating, and testifying. And then there are three basic sections, and they focus on spatial aspects, of course. So the first one is focused on North America and accounts of women going to North America. Then we have the Ottoman Empire, mostly travels to Constantinople. And then we have the Eastern European borders, which is something that is majorly neglected. And so I only have one account found, a very obscure one, that I include here, as well as some aspects of letters by the two writers that also traveled to Constantinople. And what I want to use as a case study for today is Janet Shaw's Journal of a Lady of Quality, because with her I can exactly show the problem or the problems that arise when you just ask, well, where are the women in this kind of colonial history? And so I think just looking at her, she's not the most particular example, but she is the most exact one, and the one that is more easy and more quickly to explain than most of the others. Of course, if you have any questions about the other primary sources, you're free to welcome to ask me in the session on Wednesday, and I will be happy to talk about all of them. But what might also be striking is that there are not many sources, and this just shows that before the 19th century, we don't really have women traveling. And this will also be just whatever kind of anthology of travel writing you will open. I will see that some of the names always pop up, for instance, like Lady Montego, sometimes Afra Ben, but mostly the women names just start to appear like in the 1790s. And this is exactly why I want to look at these 100 years between 1680 to 1780. Since there are accounts, but they are sometimes difficult to find, and sometimes scholars just want to ignore them and say, well, they are so obscure that they are an exception, so let's just not focus on them. And I would argue, well, let's just focus on them because they are the exceptions, and this is why I try to scrap up as many accounts as I could. And so these are my sources, which is of course poses a problem when you look at what I also want to do, like quantitative research. This is not a large corpus, but we will come to that as well. Some of the questions that one could ask is, for instance, that are based on these three principles that I just explained, is of course who traverses where, how are the events translated, how is this text a piece of colonial history. So these are the three questions that are evoked by these principles. And we can make these questions more particular. We can further ask, who are the marginalized figures in these texts? What are their functions? What role does the female traveler have in these events? Is she always at the center of the events? Is she just standing by, observing? So what is she doing? Especially since we just talked about the male traveler having these roles like the conqueror, the scientist. So what role does the female traveler have? Why is she traveling? And what kind of center periphery relations do we have that are either reasserted or at best problematized, and why are they problematized? And to give you a broad idea, Janet Shaw's journals are a diary of sorts. You can say it's a form of a diary by Janet Shaw, and as the official title of her journals explain, they are about her travels from Scotland, so she's Scottish, so I might change the title a bit if I decide to include her, because it's not Great Britain, but it's not Britain, but it's from Scotland. It's starting by Scotland, and she travels to North America and to the Caribbean Isles. Then she travels back via Portugal to Scotland. And she accompanies her brother, who is a young politician, and they have a family in America. And this sets right before the American Revolution. And I think that makes the text a very interesting piece of literature, because we have in her, from her perspective, an outsider's perspective, and I mean outsiders in the sense of that she didn't grow up in the Americas. And so she travels there and experiences this mood just before the revolution. And she is an aristocratic lady, so she sometimes complains about standards not being upheld, but she also is very open for people's perspectives, and she openly expresses empathy for specific groups of people. And I think that her journal is often just explained what included, if it's included at all, in travel writing research, as this one example of, well, Janet Shaw was racist, and this is a racist account, and so we can see that even female travel writers are not automatically always anti-abolitionists. And to a certain degree, this is true. So she is not directly, or she does not directly criticizes slavery. However, she is also not very much for it, and expresses in her journals a lot of critique about the plantations that she visits, and how people are treated, how the Black community has to live, how she sympathizes with them, and sees also no other way than a revolt by the Black community there. And I think her standpoint is much more complex than these small remarks often makes it out. So this is not, I don't write a defense of Lady Shaw, but I want to look at her accounts closely, to ascertain her rather complicated positions, to the different communities that she interacts with, and to how she translates into her journals this very weird atmosphere of a country just on the verge of a conflict that everybody seems to predict, but also just hopes to avoid. And I tried to summarize these problems or questions, or I tried to condense them into one question. And this question would be, in what kind of spaces do precarious bodies appear and how are they negotiated? And in the following slides, I want to briefly talk about what I mean with precarious bodies, what kind of concept stands behind that, and how this is then tied to an essential aspect when we try to think about border spaces and spatiality in travel writing in general. The concept of precarity, and also in general the ability to explore minority groups as the focus of a study, and to critically observe processes that are inherently social or political, as in the text comes from Judith Butler, and maybe you've heard of her. She is a very influential figure, especially in gender studies. So her basic claims are that gender is a social construction. And if you have questions about her, then you're also free to ask those on Wednesday. But her writings are also offer very general political social agendas, and I picked out two quotes which I hope give you a general idea of how she tries to argue for a more critical, self-reflexive and political understanding of the human. So in one of her earliest writing, I think it's Undoing Gender, she says that the humans are constructed in a field of discourse and power that orchestrates, delimits, and sustains that which qualifies as the human. So we are always in this way of destabilizing ourselves. And that she says that dehumanization, on the other hand, becomes the condition for the production of the human. So there are always humans that we try to dehumanize to reason for our own humanness. And this is a different way of explaining this self and othering process. So asserting the self, and this is exactly what happens through travel writing in the early modern centuries, is that the self constituted, they try to constitute themselves in new ways and more certain ways by pointing at other cultures that they just newly encountered, and say, well, this is the other, this is the foreign, and try to draw a very clear line between them and what is on the other hand. And of course, these kinds of oppositions are always have always a certain weight and are always constructed in a superior-inferior constellation. So of course, the European self would always be considered superior to the other, and this is inherent in the discourse. And to say, well, this process is a humanizing, dehumanizing process, just makes it way more also clear why this process is so cruel, and why it was of course very effective. But of course, nowadays in post-colonial studies, there needs to be a lot of work that they do that goes into the direction to unravel these processes and to write against them, rightfully so, and essentially so. And Butler is of course right with this humanizing, dehumanizing process. You can see it as such. However, I then found counterclaims to Butler, which are not to say that she is wrong, but to put her theory just in a different perspective. And I think this proves to be even more fruitful for my analysis. Since she said, well, bodies of precarity are those that are dehumanized. We need to see them as human to end their status of precarity. And the status of precarity is basically a status where you are without rights, without the law protecting you and your body, because you are not considered as part of the system, because you are not considered as part of the human society. But then comes, for instance, Stanley Cavell, who says that, and this goes into a slavery historical argument about slavery, that he say the anxiety in the image of slavery is that it really is a way in which certain human beings can treat certain others whom they know or but know to be human beings. Rather than admit this, we say that the ones do not regard the others as human beings at all. This is a bit of a confusing statement, but in the core of it is that we try to dehumanize humans because the humanness of them are even clearer. So for him, it's not so much about saying, for instance, slaves are not considered as humans, and this is why how their treatment, their really dehuman treatment was possible, but rather that the violence against slaves was so crucial or so prominent because they are humans and they cannot be nothing but humans. So this brings us to the essential counterclaim that shifts our perspective on precarity, which I think is essential to notice here when we try to use this concept. And I'm also listing the essay from which I gained this idea at the end of the presentation. So if you are interested in that, please look at the bibliography at the end. And so precarity for me is not that, and also for many other critics that use Judith Butler, it is not that it is a body that is considered as inhuman and it doesn't have the right to be or to be called a human, but rather that the humanness is innate and it is created through this process of difference and repetition, through and sort of identity negotiation that is a continuous process. It doesn't stop and it's always there, and it's innate to everybody. And so if we say, if we ask, well, how can people be so cruel to other people? For instance, how is slavery even possible if it's such a monstrous act, an inhuman act? It is often said that, well, they erase the fact that, for instance, the slaves are humans or they are not considered as humans, and so it becomes easy to not treat them as humans. But in this thesis that is based on Butler but also develops it further, it becomes a bit more tricky because they say they are still considered, or they cannot be seen as anything but humans. But their bodies are in a precarious state. They are in a state of crisis because it cannot be erased, and they try, and the other humans try everything to erase the humanness, which then leads to, for instance, arbitrary deaths, which are like the last resort for these people to think, well, if I can't erase the humanness of this human, even though I don't consider them as such, it needs to be erased through the end of their lives. Of course, this is a very this shouldn't be this shouldn't happen at all, but it explains some of the most horrible acts in history. And so I would also say that in my cases, when we look at slavery, we don't look at people who are not considered as humans, but they are humans, and the problem is that how others handle this idea, this concept of humanness that is just different than their own, is what creates this tension and this conflict and violence. And so this is the most confusing part of my project. And if you have any questions to that, if that wasn't clear, please let me know in our discussion on Wednesday. And now comes hopefully the part that is more interesting to you, namely that I think about what I also call before, like Butler and distant reading. So the question of how do we take, for instance, something like Judith Butler and the primary sources that I briefly talked about, and combine them with aspects of digital humanities. And I would like to do that from a cultural studies perspective, since I want to combine the benefits of cultural studies, which I think is that it adds, as you see with something like Judith Butler's theory, an heightened complexity, which is necessary when you look at something like colonial history. We have revisions of social political theories, even though these theories, and I think that is also a benefit, they are not ahistorical per se, but they are considered as transhistorical. So that means that even though Judith Butler, for instance, writes about precarity as an answer to the 9/11 attack, it is still applicable to many other sources and cultural concepts. And of course, we have these socio-spatial revisions. We had a spatial turn, also in literary theory and studies. And I think now we have border studies coming in as a field from social science that combines itself, for instance, with philosophy and becomes more approachable for also cultural and literary scholars. On the other hand, I think for the humanities, I thought about what I like about the humanities, and I'm a novice, so I did some projects, but they were very particular in what they intended to do, so I didn't study it per se. I'm self-taught, but what I like about the humanities is that you always have this benefit of an abstraction, of putting your research in a different perspective, especially visual transformations that are not only just nice visualizations of information, but they add to your understanding of the data. And we have overviews of different topics, for instance. But most interesting for me in this project is spatial humanities and the idea of GIS. And I thought the talks that we had before about GIS were very interesting. Of course, they were always focused on, or mostly focused on a big corpus and a big data set that you can use. Here I only have few texts, and I come not with questions that are derived from the corpus, but rather that are derived from my interests. And so I need to think about what I can do with the humanities a bit more differently than if I would have just taken these sets of texts and so what can I do with them when I translate them into the digital realm. And this is something that I'm just trying to figure out, and I really appreciate any kind of ideas that you have. So some approaches that I tried out are some that I also know from other projects, are for instance to look at keyword and context, really go into the text and look at these kind of frequencies. I did simple open NLP applications to look at spatial names, so space names, and to look at the frequencies and also their direct surroundings. I also tried to apply C-scores. So C-scores are words that are not with the highest frequency in your corpus, but the ones that have represent rather the mean of the corpus, which I think is a bit more telling, since the words with the highest frequency are often like function words and not words that have a specific context or tell you a lot about what the novel is about. So they are not about what is going on there, but rather about like subconscious constructions of function words and how often they are used. So Z-scores, I think, tells you more about the novel itself. And I've tried to look at C-scores, particularly as from that include spaces, and also anagrams, meaning that and not look at only one word, but rather at constructions of words. And this is what I came up with, is that I divided the novel into 4 sections. I will also explain this a bit more in detail later on, since her journal is naturally divided into these 4 sections. And then I used here the anagrams to filter out the anagrams that had the most average score. So those that occur in a relative high frequency throughout the novel, even though they are not possessing the highest frequency as the ones with the exceptions, but rather the averageness of the novel, I hope, is represented here. And what you can see is that in the second part, so this part with a lot of C-scores, a lot more phrases seem to recur in a high frequency, whereas in part 4, which is about her journey back to Lisbon and then back to Scotland, has very few recurring phrases. And among the most striking phrases, I think, is, for instance, that she often says at this house, referring, of course, to the stereotype of the woman, even though if she is traveling, is more interested with the house and the private life, and not with the public life, where she doesn't have a lot of influence on. What is also often occurring is of the British. So here we have a consciousness, a national consciousness, which is still, of course, different than her own, but is nonetheless very important as soon as she enters the Americas. And then we have the consul as well, and the most beautiful, because here in this part she encounters the most exotic images, but as she describes these exotic images, it has this repetitive stance, which is telling, which also is nicely tied to that we have these average phrases so much more intensely in the second part, since with the exotic, as she comes to face with the exotic, she also seems to has a strong style sheet to which she sticks, and she doesn't try to do something very, very unique with each encounter that she has. Whereas in part 4, where it's all about going to Portugal and to Lisbon and to being in Europe again, she seems to be much more creative in how she then negotiates and responses to what she's seeing and how she translates it. And here we come back, of course, to the translation aspect. While the Z-scores gives us some interesting anagrams to work with, I felt like it doesn't give me a good tool to approach my research question. So I rather want to look at spatial abstractions. And the one I started with is actually something that was provided to me by the first and only edition that we have from Jean's journal, namely a map that describes a journey. And of course, these maps are often included to heighten the sense of authenticity, which I talked about. However, it also gives the reader just a neat abstraction to go along as they read. And I want to go into more detail of what I mentioned about the journal being divided into these 4 parts, namely that we can see on this map, like the first long line that we have is her journey from Scotland to Antigua, and in this part she focuses on her life on the boat. And I would like to argue then in my thesis that the boat also offers itself up then as a space where people live, where everyday life takes place, and that even in this space she encounters some other social groups. The one would be the crew of the ship, and the other would be illegal immigrants from Scotland that moved to the Americas, some by force, some by choice, and that her stance towards these immigrants changes during the journey and during this practice, these everyday life practices in which she observes them, recognizes them as human, and that reduces the state of precarity by not only acknowledging their humanness, but supporting them after they reach the Americas. Then we have her say in Antiquita, and as I said, and this is of course need to be taken quote unquote, what she refers to exotic is mostly condensed in this part, in the second part. And I talked about how this also gives us the most repetitive style, where she again uses similar phrasings to refer to different encounters of spaces or experiences of spaces that are new to her. Then she moves up to North Carolina in the third part, and we come to that in a minute. And then in the fourth part, she moves back to Portugal and then to Scotland, even though we just need to assume that she moves back to Scotland because this is not part of her journal. It stops in Portugal. And when we just need to imagine that she hopefully reaches home. And if we look more closely at the spatial structure, and this is something that I abstracted from NLP, are the named entities that recur in these parts. And in the second part, we have most importantly Eleanor, Bastere, St. Kitts, and Oliver C. I hope I'm pronouncing everything right. And this first part doesn't move so much back and forth, but rather has a clear path with not much diversions. And it's mostly, you could say, that she tries to describe it as a very sensual experience, as I mentioned before. And this is something maybe where SIT scores might still be interesting, is that this follows very closely to other travel writing aesthetics, and that she simply tries in a repetitive style to explain the most seemingly, and we need to do this always in brackets, of course, exotic experiences from her perspective. We also have, and I call this positive social encounters, so family of Scottish people who are staying in these places, and she feels still a bit out of place, but she seems like she always has a good perspective on these people most of the time. And this, I would say, the displacement that she feels there is gendered because she travels with her brother, and her brother seems to fit right in, whereas she feels like she isn't part of any of these families. She also doesn't feel at home in their homes, and she rather wants to explore outside, but the outside is also frightening to her, so she doesn't really know where to stay or where to be. And so we've, at least from my reading experiences and from what I abstracted from closed reading, it seems like she doesn't really have a place where she likes to stay, but nonetheless the experience is something that is so new to her and surprisingly good, so she didn't expect to enjoy it that much, that she oftentimes has very positive responses to her experiences. If we now look at the third part of her journal, then a very different idea of her spatial travel comes very clear into place, namely that it doesn't follow the path of a traveler who rather goes in a circle and experiences one place one at a time and never returns to the places that she visited. Here she rather goes back and forth repeatedly and very quickly between essentially 3 different kinds of spaces. The first one is Shorefield, which is an estate that belongs to a distant part of family. Then we have Wilmington, where one of her friends resides, and then later on we have Point Pleasant, which becomes more important as Wilmington, for instance, becomes a more dangerous place for her. And Point Pleasant is a space of one of her friends where she can stay when she doesn't know where to go else, as well as to have her family safe there. And so we see from this rapid movement that she has back and forth these spaces, that here in this part she is way much more concerned with internal businesses, with familiar matters, and also we have a growing awareness of precarity, because she sees more clearly, for instance, other social groups, other communities, as well as plantations and slaves. And she needs to encounter those kind of groups more in more direct and intense ways. And in contrast to what I explained about her encounters with the immigrants on the boat, which she decided to support and reduce their state of precarity, at least from her perspective and from the perspective of also the crew on the boat. Here she is in a position that where she is simply the observer, and does not reduce or tries to reduce this state of crisis of other social groups. Of course, it is not she is not in the position to do that, but she also reduces herself to this state of passivity the longer this journey goes on. She seems to acknowledge that the revolution, for instance, is something that is inevitable, and she cannot do anything against it. She doesn't criticize to both sides, and in some other points she criticizes both sides, and rather she retreats more and more to a boat which promises to bring her home again. And so this question of home becomes more pressing as matter are also seemingly out of hand in the spaces that she then later resides in. To my questions, where I wonder about the applicability of GIS to these ideas, since this is just abstracting the space names and then putting them in or in the order as they appear, and in their context, of course. So I need to go into the text and also see if this is just a mention or if she actually goes to these places. And if I put this then onto a map that tracks her movement, if this is something that would I benefit from in my research, and of course, what kind of details would I need to include? So of course, it would need to be dynamic. It would need to exactly trace how she moves about, but also I would need more details, more information. And what kind of information should I need then to abstract? So this is something I'm thinking about, and I also have another example which doesn't have to do with my research. So this is an example of a project called Mapping the Lakes, and it describes a journey by Coleridge, where he moves around in one particular space, and it tracks not only his path, but also it visualizes if he has visited the place, if it's just a place that he mentions, if it's unclear, and how the route then goes. And we can see that a lot of more spaces, even if it's a dense space where he walks, so this is a home tour in Britain, even if it's a dense space, there still seems to be a lot more spaces that are just imagined than actually visited. Map, we see that he seems to really focus in the places he visited on this point, on this more radar point. And I'm thinking about maybe doing this also for source journals and for my other sources, to not only trace them, but to just have these categories of mentioned, visited, imagined, unclear, and then look how these paths go and what these paths mean, and where we have then encounters with different kinds of social groups, for instance, and maybe also different kinds of topics. So maybe it's also topic sensitive visualization. This is something I'm just thinking about and would love to hear your ideas on. This leads me just to some preliminary statements and questions, since this is something that is, as I mentioned, it's early work in progress. But something that I think will guide me in my research for now is that I determined that I want to focus on how precarity is translated in travel writing, using this more loose concept of translation that I introduced, as well as that I want to trace spaces that enable minorities to become visible. So where do minority groups appear in these writings, and how does the quote-unquote female perspective contribute to this possibility of visibility? And how can GIS make border spaces maybe visible? How can I, through subtracting and visualizing Janet Shaw's journal in more detail and with more information, give me a more concrete idea of where I need to pinpoint out these border spaces, and for instance, how she moves about these spaces and what these spaces mean to her and how she describes them. And these are not only questions for Shaw's journals, but of course for all of the other texts that I'm using. And the texts are so diverse in how they describe their travel that I need to have systems that are very flexible for how I can apply them. Yeah, and I'm very much open for any kind of suggestions regarding these questions and statements. This is my bibliography. You can just pause the video quickly to look at it in more detail, and if you have any questions about the sources, you're more than welcome to ask me. And this brings me to the end of the recording, and if you watched the whole thing and heard me talk for so long, I'm very grateful. And as I already mentioned several times, I am looking forward to hearing your questions, suggestions, comments on next Wednesday. See you then.